Hey everyone, this is Baphy, and today I am doing a follow-up to the video I put out just yesterday called Deep Dive into Clippers. Got a lot of good response to this so far, and it was a long video. It's deep dive. Clippers are a difficult subject, so I didn't want to do a full mix down demo showing how I actually set up Clippers across a whole project in this video because it was already pushing 2 hours. So that's what I'm doing today as a follow-up, and I'm going to show you how I would actually set up a project with Clippers across all the buses, like I talked about in that last video. And you're going to watch me go through the process, talk about what I'm doing, and I'll show you how to set those Clippers as transparently as possible, and I'll show you why and how setting up Clippers across your project buses will actually help your mastering limiter do a better, cleaner, less distorted job when you're trying to hit competitive loudness. So again, if you haven't seen these earlier videos, pause this, go back and check them out. Really, you should start with the second to last video of my mastering deep dive, which talks about why you might want to achieve competitive levels of loudness, and specifically how you have to mix into a mastering chain in order to work at competitive loudness levels. Not going to rehash that here, just go watch this video. And then the previous video talked about Clippers and hard Clippers versus soft Clippers and Clippers versus compressors, etc. So go check those out. We're going to jump right into the actual doing it demo today. Now, this is a project that I recently released. It's not a festival-oriented banger. This was actually more of a sync project for a gaming project, a gaming company. So it's kind of a hybrid between heavy festival-oriented bass music and game-oriented music. This was meant to be used mostly during the promo sales pitches to development orgs and funding orgs. This isn't necessarily music that will be used in the game, but the idea here was to feature a lot of the vocal game assets in a song with high energy. So I wanted to make something that was sort of straddling the line between typical sync work for videos and stuff like that versus a real heavy banger. So I wanted it to have the heft and energy and hotness of a banger, maybe not quite as vertical in the drops, quite as heavy in the drops, but still have, you know, a good epic feel to it. And of course it has to feature the game vocals very prominently. So they very much dominate this mix. So it's not really your standard banger, but it sounds kind of like a banger. Technically, it's a mid-tempo tune done in a dark Phrygian key, but I wanted to slow it down and make it not quite dancey and a little more like atmospheric and brooding and slow down the tempo. So what I did was I actually made the kick and snare halftime against an already slow mid-tempo, mid-tempo bass tempo of about 110. So, you know, there you go. Just some excuses for the song. It's just what it is. So recently did this, and I went back, and to simplify this demo, I basically flattened everything to all the groups to audio. You're not seeing all my tracks, you're just basically seeing the group buses. These are all just stems for the groups, so there's not that many actual tracks here. And probably what's useful to show you is that this whole thing was normalized around, or anchored around, a kick and a snare that were hitting around -6. That was sort of the anchor point for my gain staging. So here on the drum bus, you can see I just did a quick playthrough to make sure my CPU could handle it in video mode. Kick and snare are hitting at about -6 peak, but it's still a very quiet track overall because, again, this isn't a total banger. I've got everything balanced so I won't be blowing out your ears, and this will be a lot of technical fun because I can't record videos with my ASIO sound card. Voicemeeter Banana doesn't work very well for me, so I do everything through OBS, and OBS can only hear the Wasapy bus by default. And so I'm really taxing my CPU a lot. We're going to, but I think it's okay. I've done some tests. So we're going to focus just on the climax drop, because I'm just showing you what it takes to get your climax drop up to a competitive level, which is roughly -7.0 LUFS across the width of the climax drop. I'm not going to play the whole song for you. It's out there on SoundCloud and a few other places if you want to hear the whole thing. We're just going to be looping here in the climax drop, because that's the part where you have to pay the most attention. And so let's let you hear this first. Now, a quick reminder as you hear this, just like I talked about in my mastering deep dive, when you master to a competitive loudness, everything changes when you squash your mix's dynamic range down to like a total of 7 dB of headroom, right? And the mix that you actually send into the master sounds a little funny, which is why you have to mix into your mastering chain when you're working at competitive loudness levels. You can't just do this mix in isolation way down at like -18 LUFS and -12 peak and send it off to a mastering engineer and expect it to sound good, because your mix at that lower volume level or loudness level and at such a wide dynamic range, what sounds good there will not squash up correctly, right? When you squash things up, all those quieter sounds in your mix become proportionally much louder and other things change. And so your basic pre-master mix ends up sounding a little wonky when you set it up correctly for a loud mastering target. Okay, so when you first hear this, you're going to go, holy crap, that snare drum is loud. And everything else might sound okay to you, but that snare is really going to stick out like a sore thumb. And that's okay, because it's just, number one, I wanted this track to have a very sharp, snappy, prominent backbeat. That is the main beat of the song. The kick is a little downplayed in this one on purpose. So just, don't go, oh my God, that's the worst mix in the world. Yes, it's a very weird sounding mix, because this is what I did was I took my finished project, turned off all the mastering chain stuff, all the mix bus chain stuff, and bounced out my stems for the individual group buses. And so that's what you're hearing is how they sounded raw before really being fed into anything else. And anyway, here we go. So this is what we're working with. And over here in this first oscilloscope, this is my master track we're looking at right now. We're going to be watching the signal coming in. It's very low in total energy. We're going to look at what the waveform looks like as it enters the master bus. And then I'm also going to throw up a loudness analyzer here and let you look at the peak values and the loudness values. Okay. Okay, so there's a lot of lag because there's a lot of latency on this project because I've got all my mastering stuff engaged, right? We've got almost a half a second worth of latency with all the stuff going on. Now, you're hearing it through some of the basic EQing and processing of my mix bus chain. We're not going to talk about the mix bus. The mastering chain, although it's on, everything in here is actually kind of not doing anything right now. The Clippers set to 0. Pro L2 is currently not doing any gain at all. So we're not really getting any coloration or squashing yet from the master chain, even though it's on. But everything's engaged just because I wanted to make sure I'd have enough CPU headroom in this mode. Normally when I'm mastering, I've got my audio buffer size up at about 2048 and I have plenty of CPU headroom. But when you work through Wasapi, you've only got basically a 448 sample buffer, and it taxes your CPU a lot more. So I think we're in good shape. Anyway, the point here is in its current state, as the pre-master summing of all the individual group buses enter the master. We're basically hitting -6 peak right here. You can ignore true peak. True peak is just not anything I care about. A lot of producers and engineers do not care about true peak, despite what you hear all over YouTube. And then currently the loudness is -22 LUFS. Way, way, way low, way down, way, way, way down. So we need to make this a hell of a lot louder. But see, the problem is the loudness, or the RMS, the integrated LUFS and RMS are pretty much the same thing, just measured differently. But they more or less equate to the same thing. The peak to loudness ratio, or the peak to RMS ratio, is really, really wide right now. So a peak of -6 against a loudness or RMS of -22, that's a huge dynamic range. It's way too big. And we can see that reflected in this first oscilloscope that shows what the signal looks like as it's running through the track. Now, I'm not going to play the whole drop over and over again. We're just going to focus on the first 4 bars or 8 bars or so as we start working through this process. But just pay attention to this oscilloscope here. Ignore this one. This is after the mix bus chain. Just look at this one right now. Okay, that's enough. So you can see that, the kicks and the snares are way, way high, super high above the body of the, where most of the sound is, where most of the basses and subs and vocals and everything else are. So this is ridiculous. And this is what a lot of your mixes will end up looking like by the time you feed them into your master chain. So we need to control this, because if you send this directly into the limiter, it has to work so hard to squash those all the way down to here, and it wrecks everything else right around the peaks where it's squashing it down, because it's pushing down so far. And it doesn't just push the peaks down, it pushes down all the other sounds that happen near those peaks and after those peaks. So just to briefly show you how bad this is, if I were to feed this pre-master directly into the limiter and crank it up, let's go to my mastering chain, let's go find the limiter. All right, here's Pro L2. I'm not going to even talk about Pro L2 versus Elevate in this video. We're just going to use Pro L2 mainly because of its great metering tools, so I can show you things and demonstrate things. So here's what the mix looks like coming into Pro L2 without any clipping of any sort anywhere. I'm not using clippers anywhere at this point. So all right, peaks are way above the body. We need to push everything up. So let's crank it up. Let's try kicking it up like by 10 decibels and see what we get. Now I've got Pro L2 set up so that it's compensating for my gain by reducing the output gain. So it's going to sound the same to you. We're just going to see peaks starting to get shaved. We're going to see this loudness value go up, but I can't let you hear it at its full mastered volume because everything gets wonky for YouTube videos. So here we go. Okay, so we add 10 dB of gain. We're closing that gap that's, there's already a gap of about 6 dB here. So really what we're doing at this 10 dB push is we're adding about 4 dB of gain after those peaks hit the ceiling. Now, the way mastering works, especially when you're using oversampling in a limiter, is that the actual peaks, especially because of oversampling, will exceed 4 dB, right? And so it's actually having to do, some of those peaks are going like as much as 2 dB higher than they might if I weren't using oversampling. And so the actual amount of gain reduction at its highest was like doing as much as 6.7 dB of gain reduction on certain peaks. Overall though, watch the little numbers that pop up as the waveform plays. Yeah, so, the snares especially are needing to get shaved by this much to help fit everything into, the new ceiling, which is 0 dB in this case. Okay, so already we're having to do a really large amount of gain reduction. It doesn't sound too bad because, again, well, God, I don't want to go into it, but it's a common technique for loud mastering to make your kicks and snares a lot louder than usual in your pre-master, because by the time the clippers and final mastering limiter tames those things back down, everything just works out right. So it's like you have to get used to like making pre-master mixes that are a bit snappier on the kicks and snares than you might normally choose to do. It's just a thing about loudness. Okay, so anyway, we're still nowhere near -7 LUFS. We're only hitting like -11, right? So let's push it some more. Let's see how far we have to push this to get even close to -7 LUFS. Okay, so we're having to do as much as, 9 to 11 dB of gain reduction. We're still not hitting -7, and you can hear that those kicks, especially the kicks, are already getting really soft. They're losing their sharpness and knockiness, and now they're getting a little soft and tubby sounding. So we're already pushing this. I mean, we should never push a limiter this far. -11 gain reduction is just like, no, don't want to do 11 gain reduction on a mastering limiter. Let's push it farther. Let's see how far we have to push this thing to actually get to -7. Let's try about there. Okay, see, we're still nowhere near -7, and those kicks are way too soft. So I'm not even going to go any farther. We're having to do a ridiculous amount of gain reduction. We're making the limiter work way too hard. And limiters do not like to work hard, or they start tearing apart your mix. And in this case, mostly it's affecting the kick and snare. So what I'm going to do now is just let you hear how bad it is. I'm going to use this button to bypass Pro L2, and you can hear the original dry signal coming into the mastering limiter versus what the limiter is doing to it with this much gain reduction. So let's turn it off and hear it, the dry signal again. Okay, so you can hear how terrible that is. And this is what new producers run into when they're like, okay, I want to make bangers. I want to do, trap music, dubstep, future bass, mid-tempo, all that stuff, right? I want to go play stages and be a DJ. And they run into this because they struggle to understand how everyone else gets those loud masters. Okay. So now, how do we fix this? What are ways we can fix this? The whole thing we're trying to do is make the limiter work less hard, okay? So the most obvious and simple thing we can do, and honestly what I used to do before I knew better, I already knew about clippers. I knew about clippers for a long time. I also knew that saturators in particular will do a certain amount of limiting. So I'm going to open up my mix bus chain and just show you briefly on my mix bus. The basic process I use these days is I use some mix bus level EQing with Smart EQ, and then I do a little shaping of my low end with Ozone 9 low end control. And then I use Gullfoss. I like Gullfoss. I use Oxford Inflator. Now, Oxford Inflator is effectively a saturator. It brightens and saturates, and so it's kind of a soft clipper. It's essentially a kind of soft clipper. And it doesn't work quite like clippers. They use a whole different approach, but the end effect is it's basically a saturator. And so it makes things a little brighter, louder, because saturators are clippers. They're just kind of soft clippers. And a clipper brings the peaks down so you can raise the volume up. Okay, so Oxford Inflator in my mix bus chain is already doing a little bit of saturation, and it's already bringing peaks down a little bit. And then Kramer Master Tape is a tape saturation simulator. So I've got two different saturators in a row. This is doing a kind of digital saturation. This one's doing a kind of analog saturation for coloring. And then I do a little mono shaping, some simple mono shaping. So if you look at these two oscilloscopes, pre-mix bus chain and post-mix bus chain on this side, watch the subtle differences. You're actually going to see the peaks getting a little bigger at the same time that the thicker caterpillar waveform in the middle gets bigger, and that's just the total effect of the mix bus chain. Okay, so even though I'm using a couple saturators and controlling peaks, other things in that process, namely the EQ stuff and the mono shaping stuff, is like emphasizing certain peaks again, right? So, you know, just using saturators as part of a blend of total end processing, you know, peaks are going way up from these. These are taming them down a little bit again. But the net result is that compared to what was fed into this mix bus chain, these two things cranked up the peaks way high. And even though I tamed them back down a little bit with certain coloring saturators, it still wasn't enough. And so the peaks over here still end up looking higher than the peaks over here. Look at that one. Okay, so just because you're using a few saturators or clippers somewhere in your mastering chain doesn't necessarily mean you're controlling everything. We have to do a final level of control just before we start doing the true mastering or bringing it up to full loudness targets, right? So that's why here in my mastering chain, the very first thing I have is a clipper. And right now it's not doing anything. It's doing no clipping, okay? So I'm going to use this oscilloscope right after the clipper to help me pull the peaks down to where I want them. My goal here is very simple. We're going to look over here in this oscilloscope, and I'm actually going to pop this open in a larger window. And we're going to watch everything else that's underneath the kick and the snare. And I want to see where the highest stuff is that isn't kick and snare. And I'm going to make a note of where it sits on this graph, kind of. So here we go.
Such power. Yep.
Okay, right here, I just know for a fact this is one of the highest non-kick and snare things I have in the track is right here. So this is what we want to clip to. We want to clip all the stuff off here, all these snare and kick peaks, but we want to leave these things untouched. That's my goal. So I can tell just by eyeballing this, I'm probably going to have to put in a fair amount of drive to do it. I'm also going to make this slightly larger by increasing the volume here so I can get a little tighter resolution. So at first we're going to see everything peaking way above the ends at 0 dB full scale on my oscilloscope. And then I'm going to bring up the drive and shave things down looking specifically at this thing here. Let's make this even louder.
Such power. Yep.
Okay, again, this is where I want to stop the limiter. Just above these two little peaks here that were the vocals saying such power, right? I pretty much want to stop right on this line. So that's what I'm going to shoot for here. By the time I set it this far, it's below that line. This is where it was clipping, so it's back here somewhere. And here's a little thing about saturate. If you decide you want to use saturate, the way saturate works, everything from 0 to 12 dB of gain is effectively neutral and linear right up to the point of where it starts to clip. As soon as you go past 12 dB, you are now overdriving the signal into the saturator algorithm. So this is a really important point if you use saturate. Everything up to 12 is neutral. Everything over 12 is overdriving the saturator a little bit for some extra hotness. And for sound design purposes, you might want to do that. And Dan Gillespie designed it that way. So when I'm doing transparent clipping for mixing and mastering purposes, I never want this value to go above 12 to get where I want to go. If my signal is already so quiet that I need to push harder than 12, what I really want to do is stop at 12 and then or just below 12, and then I want to push up the input gain to basically like get the original signal up higher so that, you know, the clipper doesn't have to work any harder than 12. So I just, the way I do it is, let's see, how do I get this back to 0? Double click. Yeah, just do 0. The way I do it is I'll just drive all the way up to 12, and if that's still not enough, then I leave it at 12 and I start pushing up the input gain. Okay, so with that in mind, I think we can get pretty close to where we want, right around 12. So let's watch this again. I'm going to set this just below 12, and we'll take a look at what's going on here. Okay, so at 12, it's just above that line. So let me kick up the input gain just a tinge, just like half a dB.
Such power. Yep.
All right, so that's a good amount of clipping that's transparent, and I can send that into the limiter. And this is pretty much what you want something to look like when you send it into the limiter. Let's look at this one more time.
Such power. Yep.
Okay, so I'm freezing it so you can really see this. The idea is you want to take the transient peaks, the sharp, high-frequency transient peaks of things like your kick and your snare, and you want to clip them down, but what you don't want to do is clip everything else under that. Now, practically speaking, sometimes you might choose to even cut into these vocals a little bit, or into some other like bright super saw snare or synth or something. But just be aware that if you do that, you're now starting to add some distortion, some hard clipping distortion to those sounds, and that may or may not be desirable. You may not notice it, it may be very subtle, but if your goal is maximum transparency, maximum amount of actual change to your sounds and your timbres of your mix that you work so hard on, you don't want to clip into these things. So you have to pay attention, you have to use a good oscilloscope, you have to blow things up so you can see things, and you have to just sort of know and understand what sounds you're looking at so that you can decide where to stop the clipping. So this is incredibly transparent clipping. The only thing I am affecting is the kick and the snare. If I were to use this active button to bypass the clipper, let's let you hear the difference real quick. It is going to affect the kick and the snare a little bit, but again, remember, they're mixed weird because of this, and this is actually closer to the end goal I have for the kick and snare. So just because there's a difference doesn't mean it's a bad difference. All right, here we go. This is without the clipper.
Such power. Yep. Just like this. Ooh, I like that.
Okay, you hear how suddenly the snare isn't so overbearing anymore? The snare isn't in your face and way too loud for that mix. Again, this is why you mix into your mastering chain, including any clippers you might be using. You kind of have to, when I work, I know how to set up my mastering chain really fast. I know exactly what I'm looking for. And so as I work through my project, when I get to the point where I really want to start hearing how sounds are going to survive that push to loudness, which I talked about in this video, that's a big concept behind this mastering deep dive, is you have to know whether or not certain sounds you have are going to survive that push to loudness and the kind of clipping that's going to happen and limiting that's going to happen and the balance of soft, quiet sounds to louder sounds, all that's going to change. So you need to know what's going to happen. You need to know if a sound can actually be pushed loud. And in the case of this snare, as I was working through the project, I was continually refining my mastering chain, and it's off most of the time and completely deactive, so I don't have huge latency on my project, but I periodically, just like doing a mono check for mono compatibility, I would periodically activate my mastering chain at that point and hear how everything was sounding going through things like this kind of limiting and clipping of the dynamic range. So the snare in this case sounds better and more balanced with the clipper on, right? Okay, so we'll keep moving on. So I basically have this set up where I'm clipping it just the way I want to go into the final limiter. So now what we're gonna do is keep walking over here to the limiter section. Now, let's see what it's measuring before it goes into the limiter. Right now, Pro L2 isn't actually doing anything, right? And so we can measure the loudness in Pro L2, but I'll also show you, I really feel like Loudness Analyzer is one of the most versatile, useful, and simple overall meters for loudness and peak, because I'm always interested in what's happening with peak as well. And it also shows you crest factor, which is really useful. So we're just going to look at this in both of these as we play it. Now this is post clipping. We're going to see what kind of value we're hitting now.
Such power. Yep.
Okay, so we can see that we've got 12 dB of headroom. Our peak is 12.4 below zero. Our loudness hasn't changed, of course, because I need to keep the loudness the same for you people, or I'll be blowing your ears out, and YouTube videos don't like that. So everything's gonna, this LUFS here won't change just yet. I'll make it change later by doing some tricks. In fact, we're gonna start getting into that now. But the main thing I want to point out is that the clipper gave me a full 12 dBs of headroom. So we can start, and this is what I would normally do at this point. I could, and let me show you something else too, because you don't even need to use a separate peak analyzer at this point. I was just showing you that for reference, but usually I would just be looking at the output meter here in Saturate. Let's play this briefly and let you see what the output meter reads. So we can see this says negative 12.4 peak, right? And this is what I need to know. I need to know this value. How much headroom do I now have? And now I could just turn off the automatic gain compensation and let it push everything all the way up, right up to the ceiling at zero. But I don't want to do that. I want to give my mastering limiter a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit under 0 dB ceiling. So I usually don't just turn off the clipper. Instead, I leave it balanced like this. And right after the clipper, I come in and I put in a gain type utility. So in this case, Bitwig's version of utility is called tool. And I'm going to double click this and give it 11, I'm sorry, that was supposed to be 11 dB of push. So now after the clipper, I have 12.4 dB of headroom. I'm going to push it up by 11 dB. So now I should have 1.4 dB of headroom going into the mastering limiter. So let's open up the Loudness Analyzer again, which is again after this tool and oscilloscope. We're going to see what the peak reads now. We're going to look over here at the mastering limiter again. My bad. I'm so sorry for that. I also need to come over here and compensate for that. Really, really sorry for that. I hope I didn't blow your ears out. I'm going to do a negative 11 here. All right, that's the only real push I'm going to do. We're not going to have to play this janky game too much for the sake of a YouTube video. Okay, one more time. Resetting. Okay, so you can see that now we're peaking with about 1.4 dB of headroom. And you can see that the peaks are now much closer to the 0 line in FabFilter Pro L. And even though I'm doing 0 gain, I haven't pushed it at all, it's still doing a tiny bit of gain reduction. And again, if you don't understand that, it's because of oversampling. It's just the nature of oversampling that it's going to add additional peaks to things. And it's okay because at the end of this clipper, at the end of this limiter, like I talked about in my last video, there's a hidden clipper that takes those peaks and shaves them off anyway. Okay, so main point is you want to do your clipping, get your waveform set up looking the way you want, and then you have to, crank up the gain so that what you're feeding into your final mastering limiter is high enough that you're letting the algorithm work correctly. I think in most FabFilter and Ozone products, they basically say, look, your incoming volume should be like somewhere above the 75% range of whatever meter or graph we give you, right? And that's typically a good balanced gain staging to send into this tool to let it do its job right, to let the algorithm work correctly. You don't want to send a super low signal into a final limiter like this. You want to send one that's closer to 0, right? Somewhere between 5 or 6 and 0 is roughly where those peaks should be hitting in order for the limiter to do its job well. Okay, so now we're now hitting without any gain at all. We're hitting negative 11 LUFS all of a sudden, right? So we don't have to push very far to get to 7 now. So let's push up the gain a little bit and see if we can get close to 7 and what that's going to sound like and how much gain reduction is being done by the limiter. Okay, so we're pretty close to 7. It was riding around 7 for a while, but as it goes on, it was dropping down towards 8. So I still would want to push a little bit higher. We're doing negative 5 dB of gain reduction, which is close to the limit, but not the actual limit for how far you want to push a mastering limiter. So let's just push this up a little bit more. Let's push it up to like 5.1. Let's try again. Okay, so we're still not quite at exactly negative 7. We're almost pushing that line of negative 6 dB of gain reduction. So this is a point where a year and a half ago, I would have stopped. And a lot of producers who kind of get this far in their knowledge set for self-mastering would stop. And the basic rule of thumb was, well, you're shooting for at least negative 7, because that's really that competitive level. But certain songs are hard to get there because of the way they're set up and the way sounds are overlapping and yada, yada, yada. And so if you have to take a little bit less loudness, that's okay. Like you can go down to negative 8 LUFS and it's really not that bad. You'll still be kind of sort of in the ballpark. You won't sound really that far out of line with other songs that are sandwiched on either side of you in a DJ set or whatever, or a playlist on Spotify. So a year and a half ago, I would have stopped here and said, I guess that's just as loud as I can make the song, because I know if I push this even harder, I'm going to start making that kick soften up too much and lose its crack that I want it to have, its knock. And the snare probably will get a little too soft sounding as well. And it's just like, you know, it's always a trade-off and a compromise and finding a balance for things. So this is where I would have stopped before I understood clippers even better, and that you should clip all over your project and not just one time on your mastering bus as a final cleanup before you go into your mastering limiter. But you can already see how much just one single round of clipping at the end very transparently has helped the mastering limiter do its job better. It doesn't have to do a ridiculous amount of gain reduction and soften things up too much. Now let me show you that. I'm going to bypass the limiter on and off and let you hear, you know, the post-clipped pre-master before it comes into the limiter, and then what the limiter's doing to it additionally. So here it is out of the clipper but not limited, and then when this is off, you're going to hear the limiter too.
Such power. Yep. Just like this.
Okay, so what you're hearing is, depending on your taste, you might think that the kick and snare sounded better and punchier without the limiter engaged, like just post-clipper, and they do. There's no question they do, but the point is that's always the trade-off. When you're going to an extreme range of dynamic range, a competitive level of loudness, certain kicks and snares will not survive that trip. Now, in this case, that's actually where I wanted the kick and snare to sit. I didn't want them to be overwhelming and completely dominating the mix like we might do in some other tunes where, you know, the kick is holding down almost all the low energy of the kick unless, you know, subs are going at the same time. But I wanted this is actually where I wanted it to be. This was the level I kept pushing for during my mix down while checking things into my mastering chain while up at a pretty close to my loudness target. All right. And certain kicks and snares will sound better. And this is one of the reasons most bass music tends to use very knocky snare kicks and keep the kicks out of the sub region. They typically let the subs themselves own the true sub frequencies where the boom is. And they'll make the kicks fairly knocky and not that boomy. You got to find that fine line where the kicks still have some meat to them, but you don't want them and the subs overlapping, or you drive your limiter crazy too. One has to own the subs completely. And so that's where I was kind of going with this kick, is I wanted it more knocky and less thumpy. And that's why you hear it becoming less thumpy as it gets pushed into this final amount of squashing from the limiter. Anyway, point is, you can do a pretty good job with one single round of clipping on the master just in front of your mastering limiter. And it's certainly better than not using any clippers at all. But there's a better way. Now what we're going to do is we're going to basically reset this clipper and reset this mastering limiter. We're going to take them back down to 0 and start kind of from scratch. And now what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the project, and on each of these buses, not the vocals, because you don't need to clip vocals usually, but all of my synth type sounds and folders and groups, my drum groups, I'm going to do some clipping, transparent hard clipping on each of these groups where it's needed. And then we're going to see what the master looks like then, and how hard we have to make the mastering limiter work. So this is the meat of the demonstration right here. I'm going to prove to you that doing a lot of small amount of clipping all through your project is a magic thing. Okay, so let's go. So we're going to start at the bottom. I have an atmospheric track. Let's solo it. Let's let you hear. I don't really have anything during the drop. It's blank during the drop, but I do see this tiny little blip right here where there's a big transient. So let's zoom in and put my playhead like right here. Let's zoom in a little bit. Let's blow this track up just to show it to you, right? that's a pretty big sweep that gets really loud at the end. I don't know that it's a good idea to clip that. It may not sound good, but we're going to see. So again, I'm putting my playhead right here, just a bar before this sweep, and we're just going to hear what this sweep does. And we're going to watch it in an oscilloscope. I have a single oscilloscope down on this track. All right. I would be tempted to leave that alone, but as I look right above it, as I put my cursor right where that final transient is, and I look right above it, and I zoom in really close on this percussion track, the drum track, where a kick and a snare is happening, I can see that this thing is kind of almost summing into or with a kick. It is fading out before the kick starts, right? It goes, and then I've got a slight little gap before that kick comes in. So this really might not be a problem, and I probably don't need to clip it. But let's double check anyway. I'm gonna put my playhead back here, and we're just gonna, really look at this kick track and see where the sound from the other track stops, and make sure they're not bleeding into each other and that I have to do anything about summing that might be happening higher up in the project. I'm going to bring in the kick and snare too. Boy, it's really hard to tell, isn't it? Let's hear just the kick here. Now you're hearing some weird processing on my master bus that's doing a stutter effect. So really what's going on here, these aren't masking each other or stepping on each other or really truly summing with each other. So I'm going to leave this one alone because this kind of sound, if you clip it, it's definitely going to change its timbre a little bit. So again, I'm just showing you my thought process. If I'm going through this final segment of mastering and setting everything up to really be as clean as possible going into my limiter, these are the sorts of things I think about. Okay, so the verdict is we don't have to do anything to this FX Atmos bus. I'm just going to leave it alone. Now let's zoom back out and look at the melodic bus where I have all my melodic sounds. There's a few little bumps and stuff here. Let's and like here's my kick and snare. So I have a lot of kick and snare things going on here that might be overlapping with some of these little bumps you see in this green track. So let's take a look, see how they're lining up. Zoom in a little bit. All right, so they're not strictly overlapping, but I can see some things like this kick hit right here and this little transient whump right here is clearly overlapping. Now again, I may or may not be able to clip these types of sounds. I don't really see huge spiky transients on this track. It actually looks pretty controlled, but let's listen to it and see what this section kind of sounds like. Start my playhead here. Okay, and looking at the oscilloscope for this melodic track, it's in good shape. There's see, these are tiny little transient peaks here, but they're right down at the same level as the rest of the waveform. They're not super high. So I'm going to leave this track alone. Don't need to do anything with this one. Okay. Now, depending on the kind of melodic sounds you're using, certain ARPs or plucks could be really peaky with their transients, so it's usually worth checking out your melodic track and just, peeking in on it. Now I'm going to start relying less on zooming in and around the arrangement and just rely more on the oscilloscopes. That's why I like oscilloscopes. That's why there's an oscilloscope on every single track. So let's look at our interject track. This is where I'm putting in weird little sounds in the middle of the other drop sounds. And I am going to zoom in just on this section a little bit, just so we can focus on where we're really doing our work. Again, I do not see significant bumps here. There's a few little bumps right here. So let's go play like from this point forward, and let's watch the oscilloscope for just this drop interject track. Okay, again, those transient peaks are not anything to be concerned about. It's already a very well controlled track in terms of its dynamic range. So we're not going to do anything to this one either. No point. Let's move on to the drop sounds track. Again, this is the main section we're concerned with. Even at this high level, I'm not seeing big blips. But let's start here at the very beginning of the drop section and just let's see what this waveform looks like in its respective oscilloscope down here. Let's solo it so you can hear it. So again, it's very controlled already, right? I did a decent job of mixing these things, but again, especially for drop sounds, you might have really peaky stuff going on, right? So it's worth checking your drop sounds track too. So in this case, I'm not really, in this project so far, there hasn't been a need to do much peak to RMS control or crest factor control of my more tonal sounds in the song. They were already pretty controlled just from the sound design and processing that went on. So your mileage may vary, depends on project, but in this case, I don't really need to do anything to these sounds. Now, what I'm going to do next, though, is check their summing point, because this is where things get interesting. I want you to really pay attention. None of these original tracks needed to be controlled. Their peak to loudness ratio was already really good. Their crest factor was already really clean. But what happens when all of these are summed together onto their respective group, their summing point? Now, I don't have a printed track here. We're just going to watch it in the oscilloscope. So let's watch from the start of the drop here. And let me make absolutely 100% sure I'm on the right track. Let's solo it to just those sounds. Okay, so I am seeing a few little peaks that could be controlled. This line right here, and you know, I use this trick in the oscilloscope. You can't see it when it's frozen, but I use this trick to just make the waveform bigger or smaller. Let me see the resolution a little more cleanly. So we can see that most of the body of this is here, and that these little caterpillar peaks that aren't sitting up that far, but they're still very transient, short, sharp, high-frequency sounds. So these are safe to clip, right? So I'm probably going to put a clipper on this total grouping bus for all of the melodic tonal sounds, all the synths, and I am going to control this bus a little bit. Now, let's do it this way. I'm just going to pop in right after my duckers, because I'm ducking this track against the vocals. We're going to put in saturate. We're going to leave it hard clipping because I don't want to affect anything under my clipping threshold. If you don't understand why soft clipping would do that, go watch my last video if you haven't yet. So we're just going to do the tiniest bit of drive to this and just basically look to control peaks like this one. We're going to try and take everything down pretty much to this line. Let's unfreeze this so we can see it. Okay, what's going on? I've got something funky going on. I'm on the synths group. I've got a clipper. That's the clipper I'm working. Oh, it's just because it's way below 0. That's what's going on. So this one, I'm probably going to need to take it all the way up to 12. Yeah, I've still got things going over that line. So I'm going to have to actually increase the input gain for this a little bit. Okay, so let's reset these meters. So notice what I did. I didn't go past 12 on the clipping because anything past this is going to start overdriving the clipping algorithm. Instead, I basically compensated by pushing up the input gain into this particular track. And because of the auto compensation, I'm not making the resulting group any louder than it was before, right? This is the key. I always leave this auto compensation on and saturate. And again, this is one of the reasons I like saturate. Not only does it sound great, and you can push it much harder than a lot of other clippers, even standard clip, it's just so easy to work with. There's only a few things you have to mess with. It's auto gain compensation. It's perfect. It doesn't make things any louder or quieter when you're doing like crazy things to the input or the drive. It just works. And the meters are really useful. So I've reset the meters by clicking them. And I think we've got this in the right spot because I was shaving those peaks down to these two lines. And now we're going to watch what the peak value before we sent it in was versus the peak value after we send it in. Okay, that's far enough. Now we have to do a little math because I did push up the input value, so that pushed up the peak. But if you basically take, that's 8.2 and add 5.4 to it, that would be 13.6. So we went from an original peak before the clipper, we went from a peak of 13.6 to a peak of 17.4. And the RMS stays the same. So 17.4 minus 13.6 is almost 4 dB of gain reduction. We took 4 dB of peak off of this thing. And you may go, well, that's not such a big deal. The problem is this group is going to continue to keep summing together with other groups on the way up to the master. It's going to sum with the drums. It's going to sum with the drum spice or the drum tops, right? It's going to sum with the kick and snare. And so that taking off 4 dB of extra peak, transient peak that's not really necessary down here is a very small transparent change, and it's going to take away from all the other stuff that might have been summed together further downstream. That's the point of this. So let me just toggle this on and off by clicking the active button, and you can hear whether or not you hear any difference at all from clipping this one group for the synths by just a little bit of 4 dB of gain reduction, 4 dB of clipping, basically. 3.6, somewhere around there, 3.8. So here we go. You can't hear any difference. There is no difference. The amount of distortion being created by this very transparent hard clipping is just tiny little spits, little high frequency spits that are just happening underneath those already really loud, sharp transients, and so you just don't hear it. If anything, it adds a little more edge to it, a little more attackiness to it, but it's so subtle, you just can't hear it in this case. So we've clipped this bus. We didn't need to clip any of the original sounds. They were all very well controlled, but when they summed together, they were starting to create a tiny little bit of peaks that were really not necessary. And so we shaved them off at the summing point here on the synth track. All right, we're going to keep going. Let's just collapse this, just to keep things a little cleaner. We're going to look at the drum spice now. Now, this doesn't look very peaky. This is a very quiet track to begin with. It's little filler sounds that happen in between the other beats and kicks. So let's let you hear what this sounds like. and they're very infrequent, and they're not very peaky looking at all. Again, we're going to look at the oscilloscope for this track. Okay, so you can see they're not super peaky. We don't want to kill their transientness because they're meant to sort of very subliminally stick out. And when I sequenced and arranged this song, they're not happening in an overlapping place with any kicks or snares. They're in the gaps between the kick and snares. If you look, you can see it never really happens on top of a transient peak from the kick and snare. So again, in this particular case, because I was careful in how I arranged it and made sure that these potentially transient things that could sum together were checkerboarded and separated on the grid, they're not summing together, so I don't have to worry about these peaks really like adding too much to everything else. So I'm going to ignore this particular track, and we're just going to focus on the kick and the snare. Now, kick and the snare. As I mentioned in my last video, you don't want to overclip a kick and a snare, but these have been processed already. These are peakier than they originally were because there's a lot of bus processing and track processing that were already happening on my kick and snare. So these are way more peaky than they would normally, a normal kick and snare would look like. So I do want to control the peaks here before everything keeps summing upward towards the master. I want these peaks to be lowered. I've lowered the peaks on the synth group. And so then when we sum them together, the total result won't be nearly as bad as when we started this video, okay? So let's look at the drum and kick track. And yeah, we're just gonna look at these basic spread out kicks and snares happening in the drop. So we're starting from the beginning of the drop and just watch down here. And let's solo this. Okay, those are huge transient peaks, and it's because of some processing I did to make sure they would stand out in the mix. I'm going to go ahead and zoom this in a little bit volume-wise so we can really see where the actual body shape of the kick and the snare are sitting. Okay. Kick, right? This is about where you want that transient to start, right about here, maybe a little higher, right? The snare is super poppy. Let's look at this one more time. Actually, this looks like I've got some hi-hats in here too, baked into this, so that's what these other things are. So let's just watch really close again. Actually, I'm sorry. I'm remembering this project now. That's a crash cymbal on the start. So we need to go a little further in, and we need to zoom out the horizontal range to really see what the kicks and snares are doing. Sorry, I'm talking out my butt. Let's zoom in a little bit on the offset. Let's see those kicks. All right, so this kick, by the time it's getting processed and it's sitting by itself, I feel like that transient's a little too high. Really, the shape I want is a triangle wedge going about like this. This is the very high frequency transient. If we were to zoom in even farther with our horizontal offset, let's go this way. Right? Now that's happening with the cymbal. Let's keep going. Let me blow out this window a little bit too. And let's turn off. What are you showing me here? Huh, I don't have that activated. Why was it showing me the right channel? Let's just go over here to the mid. Come on. All right, what are you dragging in on me here? That should not be showing me anything. I'm a little stumped. Am I looking at the right oscilloscope? Let's look at this one more time. Yeah, that oscilloscope. Something's wrong with my pop-up window. There's actually a very small set of visual bugs with the latest 3.1.2 update. I've noticed it a couple times in the oscilloscope. Let me just deactivate this and reactivate it and see if that clears it up. No, see, I should not be seeing a blue line. I should not be seeing this channel at all, because this little button here toggles it on and off. Well, let's at least make it show us the sides so it's smaller. All right, we'll live with that. So now we're looking at the orange color is the mid and the blue is the side. And let's okay, that's what I wanted to see. So this kick, that's too punchy. That's too much of a transient. Typically what you want if you want a punchy kick is a more straight Dorito-shaped triangle wedge. That's a little bit too much of a transient peak sitting way up above. So we're going to clip this a little bit. We're going to clip it down to about here, right? So let's just scoot this over a little bit. Unfreeze this. Let's put a clipper in right in front. All right, let's freeze this and take a look. Still a little too high, so let's take the drive up a little bit more. Let's try 8 dB and see what that looks like. There we go. That's better. I could even take it down a little more, but I'm kind of looking at this second one here. I will take it down just a bit more. Let's try 8.5-ish, 8.6. That's a good shape. Maybe, you know, we could waffle between 8 and 8.6 somewhere. Let me take it. Let's try 8.4. Now, I want you to also check out the snare. I'm going to stop it on the snare. Okay, the snare is already looking really good. And it's, if I were to turn this off, you're going to see the snare doesn't go much higher than this line anyway. I've deactivated the clipper. See, even with the clipper off, so our clipping threshold of 8.4 is affecting the kick, but not really the snare. We're just getting them both down to where they've got a good shape that we typically want them to have, and we're taking off some peaks. So again, I'm going to activate this. All right, and because it's hard clipping, it's not affecting the snare at all. It's not affecting any of those hi-hat sounds that are happening below. It's probably affecting the summed result of the kick and the crash on the very first downbeat of the drop. Right? But it's fine because the crash is all high frequency sounds anyway, and all we're doing by clipping the kick is adding a tiny little bit of high frequency spit to its transient, right? So let's look at the input and output meters and see what's actually going on here now. Okay, so we can see we went from a peak of negative 4.8 to negative 8.4. So again, we gained ourselves almost 4 dB of headroom on those peaks without changing the feel or sound or timbre in any way of those kicks and snares. Let's toggle this on and off. Here's without. Right? We haven't affected that kick in the slightest. I could probably drive this harder. But just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to stay really transparent. And we're just going to do the most transparent clipping possible on all of these buses. And we're pretty much done. We're ready to go look at the master again. So let's briefly review what we've done. Most of these tracks didn't need control. We controlled the synth bus a little bit and got ourselves about almost 4 dB of headroom there. And we controlled this kick and snare track a little bit, this kick and snare bus, actually. And we controlled it by we got about 3.5 dB of headroom back. Now we still need to look at one more summing point higher up. Now we've got all this synth sounds and vocals, well, synths, drums, and subs are summing together here at the instrumental group. So now we're going to look at the instrumental group. Again, we're just looking at the oscilloscope. There's no waveform to look at up here, so we're just going to see what this looks like.
Such power.
And let's solo it so you're just hearing the instrumental group. Okay, so clearly we've got spikes way above the body of the waveform, so we're definitely going to do a round of clipping here. So let's toss a clipper in. Now I'm probably going to have to do some input gain because this is so far down. Let's see what the original input value is. So this time I'm just going to think ahead. We've got 7.5 dB of headroom. I'm going to push this up exactly 4 dB just to make it easier to add numbers in our head later. So now the peak's going to read higher, but it's still, remember, it's 7.5, right? All right, so 4 plus 3.5 is 7.5. And I just did that so I know ahead of time I'll have enough room to do clipping here and not have to go past 12, hopefully. All right, so now we're going to push this up, and we're basically looking to just take these peaks down. I'm going to increase the resolution vertically by just basically saying turn up the visual volume. That's not actually affecting any real volume of the waveform. And let's see what this looks like. So I want to shave it to kind of between these two lines. So here we go. Okay, so there we go. We've controlled the peaks. They're still sitting above all the other sounds. Right? You heard me toggle it on and off. There's no difference in the sound or timbre of anything. Not the kicks, not the snares, nothing. It's been a very delicate, minor amount of clipping in terms of tone. I'm still keeping it way above the waveform. I didn't want to get too radical at this point. And we've controlled it by, okay, it was originally, I was doing on and off, so let's reset these meters and see what the difference is now. Okay, so we went from 4 plus 3.5 is 7.5. We went from a peak of negative 7.5 to a peak of negative 15.1. That's almost 8 decibels of clipping. And it sounds identical. Watch, I'm going to turn this on and off. Just ignore the meter, ignore the oscilloscope, and listen to the sound. You're not going to hear any difference with 8 dB of clipping on those kicks and snares. Here's the dry signal. Here's the wet signal. Right? You can't hear anything. It's transparent. It's, again, clippers are amazing when used right. Don't cut into your tonal stuff. Just work on those transient peaks that are already very high frequency, short transient peaks. Okay, so let's review. We gained ourselves 4 dB of cleanup on the synth group. We gained ourselves about 3.5 dB of cleanup on the drums, the kick and snare group. And then when all these things were summed together, we gained another 8 dB at this stage of cleanup, right? Huge amount of cumulative clipping at every summing point where it was necessary, all right? Now, finally, the payoff. Let's go to our master bus and see what things look like. We're going to sort of recreate the experiment from the very beginning of this video. So here's the signal coming into the master bus, and we want to see what it looks like in this first oscilloscope. We're also going to turn on the loudness analyzer that's just, again, before the mix bus chain or anything else. We're just seeing what the peak measures and what the integrated loudness is looking like since we did all this clipping cascade, this cascade or waterfall of clipping from everything heading up towards the master bus. Okay, now, it doesn't sound any louder because I'm playing games for the video, right, to keep the volume constant for y'all. But we've now got this peak headroom of 15.1. Before it was only around 6 dB of peak, -6. So here, going into the master bus, when everything's summed together, we went from a headroom of -6 to a headroom of -15. That's a gain of 9 dBs of headroom. So the very first thing I could do is basically crank this up post, I could use this tool here to crank everything up by 9 dB, and I'll get us back to 6. And I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to add 9 dB of gain. I've got to come over here to the end and fix this in the final one to compensate. I was using this one, I think. Yeah, this one. So this is currently at -11. I need to take it down to -20. Keep everything the same volume. All right, for y'all. But the meters will look like I've cranked this up. So let's watch this one more time. Let's reset these meters. And actually, I need to think a little bit for a minute because we did change the sound because now I'm oversaturating certain things on the mix bus chain. So we're going to do this post, but just briefly, it sounded bad because I'm suddenly oversaturating things with a much heavier input level into some of my mix bus utilities. But just from a measurement standpoint, when we brought the level back up what it was before to -6 dB, we went from a measurement that was down around -28 LUFS to -15 LUFS, right? Or -27 or 22 or 24 or something. In other words, we brought the loudness up. It's already coming into the master bus. It's already -15 LUFS, okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go take this adjustment off because I don't want to change what was going on at the mix bus. Let's set this one back to -11. All right. Sorry, I have to play these games for you. Keep from blowing out your ears. Okay, so we're gonna not pay attention to the fact that this is, it's the same RMS, it's just a lot less peaky than it used to be. We're gonna let it run through the mix bus chain like it was before so it sounds right. And just pay attention right now to the fact that, you know, even though it's less peaky now coming into the master, it's less caterpillar-like, the mix bus is still doing what it's doing, and EQs and other things are going to increase those spikes a little bit along with the RMS. The caterpillar is going to get a little fatter too, and a little bit spikier on this side. But just to show you that you still have to control things after your mix bus. Right? So even though it was very controlled coming in, mix bus processing, all the typical things you do, even if you've got saturators and compressors in there, I guarantee you it's still going to make things peakier, probably, especially if you're using any kind of EQs, and especially if you're using things that have oversampling in them and so on. So we still have to do control after the mix bus, but we've improved the situation. If you watched those supplementary videos attached to my last video, where I threw you over to one of my crew members named Nick, Reframinator. He did a couple videos that show why lots of small amounts of clipping actually results in less total harmonic distortion by the time you get to the end of things. Go check those out if you haven't. But we're still going to need to do some cleanup here in the mastering chain. All right, so we're back inside the mastering chain. We're looking at the clipper, and we're going to reset the clipper now with the new waveform that's coming in at this point. So here's our clipper. Let's see. Yeah, I'll leave you where you are. We will check out the oscilloscope over here and just do some clipping. I can probably take this off now and set it back to 0. And let's go. We're watching this oscilloscope and we're setting the clipper right in front of it. We're using this to set things. Okay, I still have to go past 12 to really clip those peaks. So let's just do, again, the simple way to do it is to measure beforehand. I'm going to reset the meter at 0 input. We're going to watch what's coming into this clipper right here on the input. Okay, so I'm coming in at negative 5.6. So we're going to kick this up again to 4. Just give it 4 dB. I'm sorry, not you. We're going to give this input an extra bump of 4 dB. And that should help us stay under 12 and still get the clipping result we want over here. Oops, and I also need to bring in the vocals and everything too. Sorry about that. Where the hell are my vocals? Why am I not getting vocals in here? Pardon me while I figure this out. I think I have something inside one of these groups soloed, maybe? No? No?
Such power.
There we go. Okay. I just didn't wait long enough. So again, I want to keep that such power out of the clutches of the clipper. So let's take this to about here. Okay, so actually I've got it just right. You can see that that's such power, these little thin things, right? They're coming right up to the threshold. Maybe that one's getting clipped a tiny bit, but who cares, right? So we've actually got this at a good level. And we have a new peak value of what? Okay, so we went from a peak of 4 plus 1.7 5.6, so 5.6 to 13.1. So we gained ourselves 6 to 13, about 6 or 7 dB of headroom from this clipping. Shape looks good down here. So let's move on and look at the mastering limiter. Let's see if this pays off. So Pro L2, get you open over here and look at the final oscilloscope while we're doing it. Reset the meter. Okay, now I want to point out, before it was, when we had it coming in here, it was already doing a little bit of clipping because of the oversampling and because the peaks were already like a little more whatever. It's not doing that anymore. It's not doing any clipping at all. So we've already improved things a little bit. This limiter is going to have to work a lot less. We also had to push this up to like plus, I forget what we pushed it up to, but watch. We're just going to get this to 7 a lot more easily now. Okay, so I want you to pay attention to a couple of things. The red trend line had a lot less low and high stuff this time around. Before, there would be some much bigger peaks. We're still staying under 6 dB. We're still not quite at 7, but remember I had to stop at 8.5 before. We got a lot closer to 7, and I could push this further all the way up to 6, or I could just go back and get a little more aggressive with the clipper and clip into some things, but I'm going to let the limiter do that final work. Let's push this up to like 6.3, 6.4, and I'm going to basically take this right up to 6 dB of gain. The main thing I want you to notice is we still have not an overwhelming, completely solid, always red kind of trend line. It's still a very beat-oriented, you know, on the kicks and on the snares, it comes down and comes back. And so it's carving a kind of gluing dynamic shape into the mix overall.
Such power. Yep. Just like this.
So basically, for this particular tune, I'm going to stop at 7.4 just because I have an irrational fear of going over 6 on my limiter. I've heard too many bad things happen. But look, we managed to get a whole nother 1.2 LUFS out of this. Before we were stopping at about 8.6. Now we got it up to 7.4. I mean, that's close enough for rock and roll. And it's not like I'm trying to be a banger. And I guarantee you, if you go listen to this track on Spotify, it has all the spectral hotness and characteristics of a typical festival-oriented banger, which is what I was shooting for this. But I hopefully have showed you that by doing some surgical clipping all throughout your project, all the way up. And again, I could have been more aggressive with some of those. I could have been more aggressive on the drum bus without even changing the tone, and easily hit 7 LUFS without changing much at all. In fact, dang it, let me do it. Here we hit 7.4. All I'm going to do is go down to the drum bus, go to this clipper. I'm going to clip a little bit harder. We're going to double check the way things sound. But I'm going to take a little more off the kick and snare here. And let's just solo the kick and snare. Let's slow this down so we can see these a little better. So I'm just going to take the transient down mainly on the kick a little bit. Okay, I went from 8 point something to 10 dot something. Let's hear it in and out, with and without this clipping. Okay, we haven't changed the timbre of that kick and snare in any significant way, but I got a little more headroom out of it. So let's go back to the master bus. And this is why I like saturate, because you can push saturate into that uncomfortable line where things usually start getting tubby and soft, and it will keep everything together. We're going to go to the master chain, the clipper on the master chain. We're going to double check the clipper. Let's just briefly turn off the, now we'll leave the limiter alone. I'm just going to look at the clipping one more time here and maybe make a slight adjustment here. We'll see. Oops, helps if we sum everything together again. Okay, I think the decision I'm going to make from a mastering standpoint is I think I can cut into that vocal for such power, because those vocals are very prominent. They're right up there, right in the very front of the mix. And the timbre of the voices and the overall hotness of the track, I think I can make that voice a tiny bit distorted with some hard clipping without really affecting it in any significant way that users will hear or care about. So we're going to clip down a little bit further here, and maybe just cut just below this kind of bar here. Let's just kick this up a little bit more. Let's do an even 10 and see what that looks like. Come on. My mouse keeps snapping back.
Such power.
Okay. Do you hear any real difference? Well, I could take it back to 8.1 or whatever. Trust me, there's not much difference on that voice, because this is what I actually did in my real mastering project, is I did clip into that voice a little bit. Okay, so now let's look at the limiter and see if we can get all the way to 7 on this track, which isn't really very vertical, and that makes it hard to get to 7. This was actually a pretty challenging track to mix loud. So let's reshape this.
Such power. Yep. Just like this.
Okay, so we are hitting exactly 7. Our gain reduction has actually fallen, right? The limiter isn't having to work as hard. I didn't even change this. That was just slightly adjusting the amount of clipping before the limiter. And we are right in the pocket. Everything sounds good. And again, I want you to notice a clue that your limiter is working way too hard is when it's just got red everywhere all the time. What you want to see in any compressor or clipper that's on a bus is you want to see a rhythmic kind of envelope being cut into the overall shape of the waveform. And that rhythmic envelope should typically coincide with whatever the most dominant rhythmic element on that bus is. So since this is the master bus, the most dominant rhythmic elements are the kick and the snare. So what we want to see is a push down on a kick or a snare, and then a gradual release that goes all the way back up when there's, enough space between the kick and the next snare. You don't want it staying down, and then the next kick or snare comes along and it only drops a little bit. If you're doing that, things are very wrong with your mix. And your compressor, your limiter is working way, way, way too hard. And the same is true for compressors. So watch how we have a nice dynamic shape where it'll cut, it'll keep other things after the kick or snare a little bit lower so they're not having to be limited and clipped. but it will rise all the way back to the top well before the next kick or snare happens and pushes everything down again. That's called gluing, and that's what we want to see in your final mastering limiter. And it's one of the reasons I still really like Pro L, even though I also really like Elevate these days. Elevate doesn't let you see this nearly as nicely and cleanly and clearly as Pro L does. But just watch this and pay attention to that part now. Okay, so it looks good. This is a great master. And I showed you how before we could only get up to about 8.5 LUFS, and we were still pushing the compressor like right up to its limit of -6.5, and it was working harder. And there was probably, frankly, from what I know about clipping now and how clipping works, there was more distortion in it because we only did one stage of clipping right at the very end, right in front of the mastering limiter. There was more of that clipping distortion. But when we reconfigured everything and did lots of little clips all the way up so that the final clip didn't have to be as extreme, and we were clipping lots of different sounds separately, we end up with less overall distortion, and especially the bad kind of distortion, the kind we call intermodulation distortion. And again, my previous video talks about that and links you to 2 other videos by a producer friend of mine who really demonstrates that concept clearly. So if you didn't see that yet, go back and look at it so you can understand why this works. So clip a little bit everywhere, and you can hit your loud masters easily, even on challenging material. You know, it's much easier to get loud masters when you have a very vertical drop with all the sounds checkerboarded next to each other instead of layered on top of each other. But this was kind of a layered drop with that, you know, that Arabian style super saw kind of sound that I have in this is constant. And that really makes it hard to hit loudness on a song because you've got too many things going on at the same time as the drums. So even though this was a challenging song, with the right technique and using hard clipping, I was able to get to that target, and it sounds very clean and transparent. Thank you for staying with me. Hope this has been a really, really informative thing for you. I know that learning about clippers was a huge aha moment for me, and hopefully it's been an aha moment for you. Good luck. Thanks. Bye.